we'll start with this. Well, I'm sure that most of you have heard by now that the Victoria Bustos versus Jessica Kamara fight is off. The fight is set to go down later on this week. Apparently, Bustos, the Argentinian, faced some visa passport issues. Something about her receiving her visa approval, but not receiving notification in time to go and pick up her passport. Thus, she was unable to travel to the United States for the fight. It seems like things are cursed for Bustos in more ways than one. She was supposed to fight Mary McGee, but Mary suffered an injury, and then changes from a McGee fight to a Kamara fight. Now Bustos, she ain't got her passport or something along those lines. I mean, I guess it just wasn't meant to be for Victoria Bustos, and it really is a missed opportunity for Victoria and Jessica Kamara as well. The WBO title, the newly vacated WBO title, that was set to be on the line in this fight. In light of this, you kind of get the sense that the stars are aligning for what could be a McGee versus Bustos fight in the future. It being that things got very personal, things got very nasty between Victoria and Mary.
We talked about it here on the channel.
I actually had the opportunity to catch up with the IBF champion herself, Mary McGee, several weeks ago in reference to the verbal exchange that resulted in Victoria Bustos using a racial epitaph by way of an emoji. The former IBF lightweight and super lightweight champion was so clearly out of line, and Mary McGee was going to make her pay for it.
But Mary got injured.
Mary had to pull out of the fight. They swapped out Mary for Canada's own Jessica Kamara. Instead, here we are. For what it's worth, I had Jessica Kamara winning that Bustos fight by way of a points decision. That was my official prediction for that fight, but things have since changed. Is it possible that McGee versus Bustos could end up being revisited in the future?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out.
As stated, I had Jessica Kamara beating Victoria Bustos by way of a points decision. But when it comes to Mary, merciless Mary McGee, I had Mary stopping Victoria, I did.
Mary's got it all.
She's a 16 going on 17-year veteran of the sport. She can box and she can punch. And if that Bustos fight would have came off, I would have had Mary stopping Victoria Bustos. I wonder now if that's not a fight that won't be revisited, if it can't happen later on. No idea what's going to happen with that WBO title. At this point, it's up for grabs, and in many ways, it seems like there's a race to it.
Because it's not going to stay vacant forever.
That is Christina Lenarditu's old WBO title that went vacant when she announced that she was with child. Kaylee Reese, she's still going to be fighting on the card in defense of her WBA title later on this weekend. And you wonder if it's not too late to get that WBO title added to Kaylee Reese's card. That way, the title itself, the WBO title, stays within the Empire stable of fighters.
Wonder if it's not too late to make that move.
We'll see. Later on, next month, on the 10th, in September, Yuli Hang Luna, the reigning WBC bantamweight champion, she's going to be returning to action against Candy Sandoval.
Desde la Arena Olímpico Laguna de Gómez Palacio, Durango.
And the Candy Sandoval as an opponent choice for the reigning champion. It's not a good choice. It really isn't. You know, Candy Sandoval, she's coming off of seven consecutive losses. And before that, earlier this year, in April, Yuli Hang Luna was in action against Barbara Munoz. Barbara was coming off of 5 consecutive losses.
Barbara's got an upside-down record.
I know sometimes it's hard to secure quality opponents, even as a champion in the sport of women's boxing. But if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, Yuli Hang Luna should be fighting a better fighter, a better caliber of fighter than Candy Sandoval, especially on the heels of fighting a fighter like Barbara Munoz.
Well, for those girls who are on losing streaks.
The silver lining for Yuli Hang Luna is that, in spite of the global pandemic, she hasn't missed a beat. She actually fought 2 times last year. She became the WBC's bantamweight champion last year with that masterclass she put on against Bobby Juarez, the then WBC champion. And that tells you that Yuli Hang's qualities as a fighter aren't the product of smoke and mirrors. She's the real thing. But since becoming a champion, her quality of competition, it has kind of taken a turn for the worse. Because Barbara Munoz and Candy Sandoval,
there are way better girls to fight in the bantamweight division than those two.
Just being honest, and I don't know what the circumstances are. I don't know that the reigning champion isn't fighting these kinds of fighters because, you know, quality opponents, they are hard to come by. It's going to take a lot of money to get some of these good fighters to travel. There's that to consider. So I'm not completely sure what the situation is. I just know that looking at these two girls' records...
Neither one of them deserves a title shot.
Barbara Munoz was on a losing streak, and so is Candy Sandoval. Every so often, in the sport of women's boxing, you're gonna bump into a Barbara Munoz, maybe as a keep busy fight, little tick over to keep the machine well oiled. That's understandable, and that's okay. But when you're fighting these kinds of opponents consecutively...
I mean, maybe there are extenuating circumstances.
Maybe money is tight, and you ain't got it in the budget to pay one of these top-tier, top-shelf fighters to travel. Maybe that's the situation. Maybe that's the case. But one way or another, the same applies. Neither Barbara Munoz or Candy Sandoval, both of which are on losing streaks, neither one of those girls have earned the opportunity to fight for a world title. Yuli Hangluna's world title. So, I mean, she's going to be in action next month on the 10th, and it is what it is.
I've been one of Oscar Valdez. I've been one of him. When he was at 126, he ain't want no parts of me either. Anybody name who you name, they had an opportunity to step in the square with me and they ain't want no parts. From Oscar Valdez to Shakur Stevenson to Josh Warrington to whoever else you want to mention that was in that whole 126 range, none of them motherfuckers wanted no smoke with Mr. Gary Russell Jr.
One time a year, twice?
Once a year.
Yeah, he doesn't get to fight that much.
It's not because I'm not trying to fight. It's because we can't get these opponents or these guys to step in the ring and compete against me. My name is whispered like I'm the fucking boogeyman or I'm like Candyman around this. You know what I'm saying? My name is whispered. They don't say my name out loud.
I seen this man call out guys at 147. At 147. Let's be real.
And these guys don't say nothing.
Yeah, you're willing to go up in weight too. You're not like 5 pounds here and there. Like.
And guess what? If someone feels as though that I'm just talking just to talk, then shut me up.
Every time you see Gary Russell these days, he's doing an interview and he's telling you a story, whether the story makes sense or not. I vaguely recall Gary Russell Jr. saying that the reason he doesn't fight that often is because he doesn't want to. Now what he's saying is because he can't secure the big fights, yet it was Gary Russell Jr. himself that turned down a big fight. A big $1 million payday with Josh Warrington.
You can't blame it on Eddie Hearn this time.
Because the quotes aren't from him. The quotes are from Gary Russell Jr. himself. He said Fast Eddie offered him $1 million to fly over and fight Josh Warrington. And according to Gary, it was beneath him. So he rejected the offer to sit out,
do nothing,
and fight no one. We're 8 months into the year of 2021, and it appears like Gary rejected that offer from Matchroom so that he could sit out for 8 months and do interviews about how he doesn't have a fight.
Whose fucking fault is that?
It's gotten to the point to where even the WBC themselves are starting to wonder, when is it that Gary and the man they ordered him to fight, Ray Vargas, are going to be returning to the ring? A question which seems like a redundancy to me since it was the WBC that ordered Gary to fight Ray at the beginning of this year. So if anybody should have a fix on those two guys' ring return, it would be them, wouldn't it?
Nothing about this guy ever makes any kind of sense.
You rejected a Josh Warrington fight about 8 months ago so that 8 months later you can jump on camera and say that he's avoiding you or he avoided you. Name drop Oscar Valdez. Oscar Valdez, who's going to be in action very soon against Conceição.
Yet another guy who's more active than Gary.
You know what I remember? I remember when Gary Russell Jr. on live television, he called out Al Heyman himself in reference to the Leo Santa Cruz fight and how, Gary's wanted that fight for a long time, but Al just didn't seem to make it happen. He never got around to it. And, they still haven't fought. But I remember when Gary did this, and I remember that Gary said that if that Leo Santa Cruz fight doesn't happen in the near future, the then near future, he was going to see about fighting Miguel Berchelt. As it stands, Oscar Valdez beat you to Miguel Berchelt.
Gary never followed up on what he said.
He never does, but he does say a mouthful, doesn't he? Calls out Shakur Stevenson, and I don't know why. Shakur's got bigger fish to fry. He's got that Jamel Herring WBO super featherweight title fight going down very soon. What's Gary doing?
More interviews.
I want to say that Gary Russell Jr. is a victim of his own indifference. His own indifference to what is his own career. He sounds disgruntled. He sounds discontent. And usually when you hear Gary, that's how he sounds. He's a victim of his own indifference to his career, because if you don't like how things are going, change your decorum, change your management, change the banner which you fight under to see if someone else can't make those fights happen. Gary's been a PBC fighter for as long as I can remember, and Gary's been fighting once a year.
For 6 years.
For as long as I can remember. And whose fault is that? Whose fault is that really? Whoever handling your career, that's who.
And you're letting him.
Gary thinks he's some kind of fucking boogeyman. He thinks people are afraid to mention his name, but how afraid was Eddie Hearn when he made you an offer that you acknowledged, you received, And you rejected. Gary Russell's no boogeyman. And if people don't mention his name, if they don't talk about him, it's because he don't fight. He's not on anybody's mind.
Not even his own stablemates.
Not really. I mean, Leo Santa Cruz reigned and still reigns as a champion in the featherweight division alongside Gary, but we've no word if and when that fight is ever gonna happen. Leo Santa Cruz ended up fighting Gervonta Davis instead, and Gary got left holding the bag, doing interviews and telling stories.
He wanted to fight both of those guys.
And for what it's worth, I think he still does. Wanted to fight both Leo Santa Cruz and Gervonta Davis, yet as it stands, they ended up fighting each other. Gary hasn't fought since the Tuxok Niambiar fight of early last year. Once again, Gary Russell Jr. hasn't fought for 12 months or over 12 months. This is a regular occurrence when it comes to Gary. And if he can't get fights with his own stablemates on PBC's Isolation Island, then perhaps it's time for Gary to start thinking to himself.
Thinking for himself.
Maybe it's time to get off the island. If you can't even get fights with its occupants, why don't you just go elsewhere? Or is it that you can't? What kind of contract does Al Heyman have this guy under?
Very fucking curious.
Very transient, absentee champion Gary Russell Jr. always seems disgruntled about something. It's always in reference to the same thing. What's not happening? Well, maybe it's not happening because of where you are. And maybe that's what needs to change, because you ain't getting any younger. In other news, it seems that Jaime Munguia and Gabriel Rosadio are on the same page, and negotiations may be underway for a fight between them. And I've talked about this fight in passing. I've talked about this fight in the past, that it does have all the makings of a very fun fight, what could be a very aesthetically pleasing fight to the eye, to the observer. And, it's a good learning fight for Jaime Munguia, but Jaime is a former champion, isn't he? And isn't it about time that he faced some of the more solid guys in the middleweight division? Gabriel Rosadio, whose last fight was at super middleweight, he might have to cut down for this fight, go down to 160 pounds.
Can he still make that weight healthy?
Is Jaime Munguia going to be moving up? I really don't know. If you ask me, that's only if you ask me, the more sensical fight and the more sensible fight would have to be Gabriel Rosado versus Edgar Berlanga. Edgar Berlanga, who's over there on the top-ranked side of things. Edgar Berlanga, who is more in need of learning fights than Jaime Munguia, because, I reiterate, Jaime Munguia is a former world champion. He held the WBO title at 154 pounds, and he defended it a number of times. At this point, Jaime should be fighting more solid guys in the middleweight division than bringing Gabriel Rosado down to 160 pounds.
Don't get me wrong, it could be a fun fight.
Gabriel Rosado is coming off a career best win, I'd say, over the then unbeaten Bektemir Melikuziev. Ahead of that fight, a lot of people felt Bektemir Melikuziev had everything it took to run right through Gabriel Rosado, and in attempting to do that, he got himself knocked out off a big right hand that Gabriel set up quite masterfully. And, Gabriel's got everything it takes to give a young, up-and-coming fighter a lot of good work, maybe even beats that young, up-and-coming fighter. Right now, Edgar Berlanga, knockout artist Edgar Berlanga, he needs that kind of work. He needs that kind of experience.
Well, he needs it more than Jaime does.
And I don't know. Maybe it's because the people over there at Top Rank and the people over there at Golden Boy, they couldn't get the numbers right for a Berlanga versus Rosado fight. Maybe that's what it is, even though it seems like the ideal fight for Edgar Berlanga at this point.
The fight makes a ton of sense.
I half expected it to go down this summer, right around the time they have the Puerto Rican Day Parade over there in New York. A Philly Rican versus a New York Rican.
I don't know what the problem is.
The bruiser versus the boxer. Edgar Berlanga being the bruiser, having a hefty knockout percentage, hefty KO record versus Gabriel Rosado and all his experiences that he's had from super middleweight all the way down to junior middleweight. He's fought a virtual who's who of guys, and a fight between them makes a lot of sense, even though in some ways a fight between Gabriel and Jaime, that makes sense too, but not as much sense as that Berlanga fight. I think it's about time for Jaime to stop pussyfooting around and step it up a bit.
He's a fun fighter to watch.
I don't have any illusions about him. I take him for what he is. A limited, albeit very fun fighter to watch. But even for a guy like that, there's a standard. And I think that it's about time that Jaime Munguia start meeting that standard. Finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, Anthony Joshua versus Alexander Usyk will be shown live on DAZN in the USA and in 170-plus countries worldwide, September 25th. UK broadcaster remains Sky Sports, pay-per-view, price to be determined. And this might be Anthony Joshua's last fight on Sky box office. Who knows what the situation will be moving forward once this fight is behind us? Hell, who knows if Anthony Joshua's even going to beat Alexander Usyk?
Yeah, some people think Usyk's gonna beat him.
I don't, but, in some people's opinions, that's the case. And opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one, and they're entitled to it. In the event that Anthony Joshua does beat Alexander Usyk and he retains those 3 world titles, those 3 alphabet titles, one is left to wonder what becomes of the situation between him and Sky. Anthony Joshua is not just any fighter. He's in control. He's in the driver's seat of his career. And I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he continues to do more business with the people over there at Sky Sports, Sky Box Office, unless the people at DAZN make him a better offer, make him a better deal for exclusivity in the United Kingdom.
You know how that works. If you want it, you gotta pay for it.
Matchroom has gone all in with DAZN, you understand. Matchroom fighters, the vast majority of them, are exclusive to DAZN. But when it comes to Anthony Joshua, he's got a little bit more wiggle room, more liberty to make decisions. And who knows? Maybe he'll be the next fighter that goes all in with DAZN.
Yeah, maybe.
The September 25th fight has all the makings of this year's gala spectacle. This year's big fight, really big fight, especially now that Spence versus Pacquiao has turned into Pacquiao versus Ugas. I'll tell you, for a big fight week, it don't feel like one.
That's not a knock on Ugas.
But you really can't fake an interest. And there were more people interested in seeing Spence fight Pacquiao than there are people interested in seeing Ugas fight Pacquiao. It just is what it is. It's nobody's fault. Whereas with Joshua versus Usyk, this is a worldwide event that the world is interested in seeing. The former undisputed cruiserweight champion versus the current unified heavyweight champion.
Over 170 countries are going to be seeing this thing.
Biggest fight of the year, as far as I'm concerned, and one of the few fights, the very few fights, that I'm looking forward to. I just hope that everything goes to plan and this fight comes off. No hiccups, no interruptions, because boxing fans could use the pick-me-up.
They really could.